Nick Martin closed the book before he finished the story. He always closed it before he finished the story. That was the rule, the one rule his wife had left him that he never broke, not once in 3 years. Close the book at page 11, never read page 12, and never ever let the girls ask what comes next. The bedroom was warm, nightlight casting pale orange across the ceiling. 3 identical faces stared up at him from 3 identical pillows, blonde hair fanned out like halos, 8 years old and already carrying something behind their eyes that no child should carry. Knowledge. Not the kind learned in classrooms, the kind that lived in the bones. Nick cleared his throat and read the last line again, the same way he always did, gentle, rhythmic, like a lullaby made of procedures. When the cardinal sits on the eastern wire, the house remembers what the builder forgot. 3 voices whispered it back in perfect unison, not memorized, absorbed, the way skin absorbs rain. That's enough for tonight, Nick said. He closed the book. Black cover, no title, no author, just a crease along the spine where his wife's thumb had worn a groove from years of holding it open. Daddy. Cora's voice. The eldest by 4 minutes, though she wielded those 4 minutes like a decade of authority. Why do we always stop at the same place? Because that's where the story ends. It doesn't feel like an ending, Wren said. The middle child. Quiet, watchful. The one who noticed things no one else noticed and said nothing about them until exactly the wrong moment. It's not an ending, Lark confirmed from the far pillow. The youngest, direct. Unafraid of truths that made adults flinch. It's a pause. Nick looked at his youngest daughter, 8 years old. Using the word pause like she understood what it meant, what it really meant, and the thing that frightened him, the thing that kept him awake long after the girls had fallen asleep, was the growing suspicion that she did. Good night, girls. He kissed each forehead. Cora, Wren, Lark. 3 heartbeats he'd die for. 3 keys he didn't fully understand to a lock he prayed would never need turning. He turned off the lamp. In the doorway, he paused. Behind him in the darkness, 3 small voices whispered the phrase one more time when the cardinal sits on the eastern wire. And Nick Martin felt something cold slide down his spine. The morning arrived sharp and bright, the kind of winter Saturday that made everything look clean and expensive. The Whitfield Towers Conference Center gleamed like a monument to money, glass, and steel, and the particular brand of architectural arrogance that said we built this to remind you that you didn't. Nick pulled his maintenance van into the service entrance around back, the entrance without the fountain, without the valets, without the 8-foot banner that read Beacon Foundation Annual Charity Gala, hosted by Victoria Parker, CEO, Whitfield Industries. His badge was gray. Gray meant temporary. Gray meant invisible. Gray meant you used the freight elevator and you didn't make eye contact with anyone whose badge was white. The girls sat in the back seat, silent. He'd had no choice but to bring them. The sitter had canceled at 6 that morning, food poisoning, and the gala contract was the biggest job his small maintenance company had landed all year. $2,000 for a day's work, setup support, AV troubleshooting, keeping the service corridors clean during the event. He couldn't afford to lose it. He couldn't afford much of anything lately. You 3 stay close to me, Nick said, turning in his seat to look at them. I mean it. No wandering, no exploring, no talking to anyone who looks important. We're here to work. We're invisible. 3 blonde heads nodded, too easily, too quickly. Nick studied their faces. Cora's expression was neutral, composed, the face she made when she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Wren was looking out the window at the building, her eyes tracking the security cameras mounted above the service entrance with an attention that made Nick's stomach tighten. Lark was smiling. That was the one that worried him most. The gala was already humming by the time Nick finished setting up the auxiliary sound system in the east corridor. Guests arrived in waves, men in suits that cost more than his van, women in dresses that cost more than his apartment, champagne on silver trays, a string quartet playing something elegant and forgettable. The girls sat on folding chairs near the service hallway, coloring books open, looking every inch like bored children dragged to a parent's workplace. But Nick noticed. He always noticed. Cora wasn't coloring. She was watching the security rotation, her crayon motionless over the page, her eyes following the guards as they moved through the atrium on a pattern she seemed to be memorizing. Wren had her head down, but her hand was moving across the page in shapes that weren't pictures. They were lines, corridors, a map drawn from observation in real time, and Lark was counting. Her lips moved silently, and Nick realized with a sick lurch that she was counting doors. He opened his mouth to say something, he didn't know what, when a voice cut through the ambient noise of the gala, a voice that made his blood freeze. Cardinal protocol remains inactive. Confirm standing position with the board before the keynote. The words came from a man in a dark suit, earpiece visible, walking past the service corridor without a glance in Nick's direction, speaking into his phone, casual, routine. But the phrase, Cardinal Protocol. Nick's hands went still on the cable he was coiling. His wife's voice echoed in his memory, not from the book, but from a conversation 3 years ago, 2 weeks before she died, when she'd sat him down at the kitchen table with a look he'd never seen before. Fear wrapped in calm. If you ever hear the word cardinal outside this house, outside that book, it means something has gone wrong. Something I built safeguards for. Something that was never supposed to activate while the girls were still young. Nick had asked what she meant. She'd shaken her head. You don't need to understand it, Nick. You just need to keep reading them the story, every night, exactly as written. And if you ever hear that word in a place where it shouldn't be, you take the girls and you leave. You don't stay. You don't ask questions. You leave. He hadn't understood then. He wasn't sure he understood now, but he understood the look in his wife's eyes when she'd said it, and that look was enough. Nick moved through the gala with the practiced invisibility of a man whose badge color made him furniture. He found the security chief first, a woman with a clipboard and the expression of someone managing 17 emergencies simultaneously. Excuse me. Nick kept his voice low. I need to speak with someone about a protocol reference I just overheard. I believe there's a contingency issue that needs to be flagged. The security chief looked at his badge. Gray. Her expression shifted from busy to dismissive in half a second. Sir, if you have a maintenance concern, please file it through the service coordinator. This isn't a maintenance concern. I heard someone reference Cardinal Protocol. That designation has specific implications that Nick stopped. The security chief was already looking past him, already moving on, already filing him under nuisance. Sir, I need you to return to your designated area. Nick tried once more. The desperation in his voice surprised even him. Please, I need to speak with Victoria Parker directly. This involves a contingency that shouldn't be active. The security chief's expression hardened. Ms. Parker is preparing for her keynote. She doesn't meet with temporary staff. If you have a concern, file it through proper channels. And then she was gone. Nick stood in the corridor, heart hammering, and made a decision that would change everything. He didn't file it through proper channels. He walked directly into the main ballroom, past the velvet ropes, past the white badge guests, and approached the cluster of executives near the stage where Victoria Parker stood reviewing her speech. Miss Parker, Nick's voice carried, steady despite the shaking in his hands. I need 60 seconds of your time. It's urgent. Victoria Parker turned. 50s, silver hair cut sharp, eyes that assessed and dismissed in the same glance. She wore power the way other people wore cologne, so naturally it was almost invisible until you got close enough to choke on it. She looked at his badge. Gray. She looked at his clothes, work boots, cargo pants, a company polo with someone else's name stitched on the breast because Nick's order hadn't come in yet. And who are you? Her voice was pleasant, the pleasantness of someone who had never needed to raise her voice because the world bent to her whisper. Nick Martin. I run the AV maintenance crew for today's event. I need to speak with you about a protocol reference I overheard. One of your security team mentioned Cardinal Protocol, that designation. She stopped him with a raised hand. The gesture was small, almost gentle, and absolutely devastating. Mr. Martin, I appreciate your dedication to your work, but I don't discuss internal operations with contractors. If you've heard something you don't understand, I assure you it's because you lack the context to understand it. Her smile was perfect, polished, the kind of smile designed to end conversations while making you feel like you'd been heard. Now, if you'll return to your station, I'm sure your cables need you more than I do. Quiet laughter from the executives around her. Not cruel exactly, worse, indifferent. The laughter of people who'd already forgotten him before he'd finished speaking. Nick felt the heat climb his neck. Not embarrassment, something colder, recognition. He'd heard that tone before. His wife had described it precisely. The voice of someone who believes their position makes them immune to consequence. Security appeared at his elbow. "Sir, you need to come with us." Two men, large, professional, the kind of firm courtesy that left bruises if you resisted. Nick let himself be guided toward the service corridor. But as he turned, he found them, his daughters, all three. Standing at the edge of the ballroom near the west exit, not panicked, not confused, watching him with expressions that made his blood run cold because they weren't surprised. They'd been expecting this. Cora met his eyes across the room, 8 years old, blonde curls, pink backpack over one shoulder, and in her face something ancient, something inherited, something that looked exactly like her mother. She nodded, once, small, the kind of nod that meant the conversation was over and the operation had begun. Nick's heart slammed against his ribs. "Girls," he called, pulling against the security escort. "Girls, come here, we're leaving. Come to Daddy right now." But the crowd shifted, a wave of guests moving toward the bar, toward the stage, the normal chaos of a gala reaching its midday peak. And in that chaos, his daughters vanished, not together, separately. Cora slipped left toward the administrative wing. Wren moved right toward the utility corridor. Lark walked straight ahead, calm as Sunday morning, directly into the executive suite hallway. 3 children, 3 directions, 3 fragments of a bedtime story that suddenly didn't sound like a story at all. And Nick Martin, pinned between 2 security guards in the service corridor of a building he couldn't afford to enter through the front door, realized with a horror that hollowed out his chest that his 8-year-old daughters knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't the first time they'd rehearsed this, it was just the first time they'd done it for real. Cora found the room on the 2nd floor, not by guessing, by knowing. Left past the elevator bank, 3rd door after the fire extinguisher, the one with the placard that read, "Records and Archive, Authorized Personnel Only." She didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and walked in like she had an appointment. The man inside was old, 60s, reading glasses, a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside a stack of folders he clearly wasn't supposed to be reviewing at a charity gala, but couldn't help himself because some people just couldn't stop working even when the world told them to celebrate. He looked up, saw a child, blonde, small, pink backpack, entirely out of place. "Can I help you, sweetheart? Are you lost?" Cora closed the door behind her. "I need the Adler binder." The man's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "Excuse me?" "The black binder." "No markings. It should be in the secondary archive, bottom shelf, behind the 2019 fiscal reports." "My mother filed it there." The man set his coffee down very slowly. His face had gone the color of old paper. "Who is your mother?" Cora said her mother's name, the name Nick's wife had carried before she married him. The name that appeared on no public record connected to Whitfield Industries, but that lived in the institutional memory of the people who'd built the company's foundations before Victoria Parker had turned it into her empire. The old man stared at Cora for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the back shelf, moved a stack of fiscal reports, and pulled out a black binder. No markings, worn. The spine creased from use. He held it like it might burn him. "She said this day would come," he whispered. "She told me someone would ask." "I thought she meant an adult." "She meant us," Cora said simply. She took the binder, held it against her chest. The old man sank back into his chair. His hands were shaking, 2 floors below, Wren entered the utility corridor through a door that should have been locked but wasn't, because the locking mechanism was analog, a physical deadbolt that required a key, and Wren knew where the key was kept. Third junction box from the stairwell, magnetic strip behind the panel. Her mother had drawn a diagram once, not on paper, in the coloring book, hidden in the background of a picture of a house. Wren had found it when she was 6, had memorized it without understanding why. Now she understood. The utility corridor was empty, fluorescent lights buzzing, the smell of old concrete and cleaning chemicals. Wren moved with purpose to a communications panel mounted on the far wall. Old, pre-digital. The kind of manual switching station that modern security systems didn't monitor because modern security didn't believe anything analog still mattered. She opened the panel. Inside, a series of physical switches labeled with codes that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't read the bedtime story. But Wren had read the bedtime story every night for 3 years. She flipped 3 switches in a specific sequence. The panel hummed. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. Not a smartphone, a landline. Connected to a line that existed on no network map, no directory, no system. A retired contractor named Harold Voss, attending the gala as a guest of honor for his 30 years of service to Whitfield's infrastructure division, felt his pocket vibrate. Not his cell phone. The pager he'd carried since 1994. The pager no one knew he still kept. He looked at the number on the screen. His face went gray. He set down his champagne glass, excused himself from the conversation he'd been having about retirement portfolios, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The system was responding, not digitally, institutionally, through people, through loyalty, through a network built by a woman who understood that the most secure system in the world was one that ran on human beings because human beings couldn't be hacked, couldn't be overridden, couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. They could only be activated by trust, and trust had a voice. The voice of a child saying words her mother had taught her. Words that meant nothing to the world and everything to the people who'd been waiting to hear them. Lark walked into the executive suite like she owned it. This was her gift, the one Nick secretly found most terrifying. Where Cora was strategic and Wren was precise, Lark was fearless. She moved through the world with the absolute certainty of a child who had never been taught to doubt herself, and people responded to that certainty the way they responded to authority. They stepped aside. The executive suite was glass and leather and the particular smell of money being managed. A senior aide sat at a desk outside Victoria Parker's private office, reviewing the keynote schedule on a tablet. He looked up when Lark entered. "Hey there, little one. Are you looking for your parent? You should probably be downstairs." "My mother was the cardinal," Lark said. The aide's hand froze on the tablet. The screen went dark from inactivity while he stared at this child, this impossibly calm 8-year-old girl who had just spoken a phrase that hadn't been uttered in this building since the woman who created it had died 3 years ago. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Which page?" "7, Lark said. Paragraph 3. The contingency for institutional failure at the executive level." The aide closed his eyes. When he opened them, there were tears on his lashes. "She said they'd be young," he whispered. "She said the children would come, and we'd know it was real because no one would believe them." "My mother built the plan," Lark said. "We're just delivering it." Victoria Parker felt it first as an inconvenience, then as an irritation, then as something she couldn't name but that crawled along the back of her neck like cold water. The keynote was in 40 minutes. Her staff should have been in position. Instead, 3 of her senior aides had gone quiet. Communications were routing through channels she didn't recognize. 2 board members had received calls and left the gala without explanation, and her chief of security reported that a maintenance worker's children had disappeared into the building and couldn't be located. "Find them," Victoria said. Her voice carried the first edge of something she would never admit to feeling. Concern. Their children. How hard can it be? Very hard, it turned out, because the children weren't hiding, they were operating, And the systems they were operating existed in the spaces between Victoria's knowledge, the analog gaps, the human networks, the institutional loyalties that predated her authority and answered to a different voice entirely. The first disruption hit 20 minutes before the keynote. Victoria's access to the building's internal communications was rerouted, not blocked, rerouted, through a switching station that her IT team insisted hadn't been active in 15 years. The second came 12 minutes later. 3 key staff members received physical documents, actual paper, hand-delivered by building employees who claimed they were following standing orders. Orders filed before Victoria's tenure. Orders signed by a name Victoria recognized with a jolt that made her grip the podium until her knuckles went white. The third disruption was the quietest and the worst. Victoria's private files, the ones stored on the local servers she kept deliberately offline for security, began printing. 1 page at a time, on a printer in the records room that no one had used since 2019. She found out because Cora, carrying the black binder against her chest, walked into the ballroom during the keynote preparation and handed a single printed page to a board member named Thomas Chen. "Mr. Chen," Cora said, her voice clear and steady in the sudden silence that followed her appearance. "My mother asked me to give you this. She said you'd understand." Thomas Chen read the page, his face drained of color. He looked at Victoria Parker. He looked at the child. And then he picked up his phone and made a call that Victoria couldn't hear but that she felt in her bones. Nick broke free during the chaos, not through force, through something stranger. The security guard on his left received a page, an actual page on a device Nick hadn't seen anyone carry since the 90s, looked at it and simply stepped aside. Didn't explain, didn't apologize. Just moved, like a door that had been programmed to open at a specific signal and had finally received it. Nick ran, through the service corridor, up the stairs, following an instinct he couldn't name toward the executive wing. He found all 3 of his daughters in a conference room on the 3rd floor, sitting at a mahogany table designed for board meetings, the black binder open between them. Cora was reading. Wren was cross-referencing pages with notes she'd written in her coloring book. Lark was eating a granola bar she'd found somewhere, her legs swinging because they didn't reach the floor. They looked up when he entered. 3 faces, calm, focused, not frightened, not even slightly concerned. They looked like children doing homework, except the homework was the systematic exposure of institutional corruption, and the teacher had been dead for 3 years. "Girls." Nick's voice shook. "What are you doing?" "What we practiced," Cora said. Nick felt the room tilt. "You never practiced this. We practiced it every night, Daddy." Wren's voice was gentle, patient, the voice of a child explaining something obvious to a parent who'd missed it. The story isn't a story, it's instructions. Nick sank into a chair. His legs wouldn't hold him. The bedtime story, the book with no title, the phrases his wife had insisted he read every night in exactly the same order, with exactly the same rhythm, closing always at page 11, never page 12. "Mom wrote it for us," Lark said between bites of granola bar. "She wrote it so we'd remember what to do if the Cardinal Protocol activated. She said you'd bring us here eventually. She said the building would call us." Nick stared at his daughters, 8 years old, blonde curls, pink backpacks, and behind their eyes the architecture of something he was only now beginning to understand. "Your mother," Nick said slowly. "What did she do here? Before me? Before us? What was she?" Cora turned to a page in the black binder, a page Nick had never seen because it existed only in the physical copy, never in the bedtime book. She slid it across the table. Nick read it, his wife's handwriting, precise, small, familiar. The handwriting that had left him grocery lists and love notes and apparently contingency plans for institutional collapse. If activation occurs through juvenile redundancy, assume primary authority has failed. Proceed to Section 7. Do not seek permission. Do not wait for confirmation. The authority is the activation itself. Below that, a list of names. People inside Whitfield Industries. People who had been waiting, for years apparently, for a signal. a signal delivered by children, because no one would suspect children, because no one would stop children, because children were invisible in exactly the way that made them unstoppable. He wasn't training soldiers, his wife had once told someone. Nick had overheard it on a phone call he wasn't supposed to hear 2 months before she died. She'd been talking to someone she trusted, her voice low and certain. He's raising them with love and routine and consistency. That's all they need. The rest is already in them. I just gave them the words. She'd been talking about Nick, about the girls, about what she'd embedded in bedtime stories told by a father who didn't know he was programming his daughters with the keys to a kingdom. I didn't know, Nick whispered. She said you wouldn't, Cora said. She said that was the point. Your love kept it safe. If you'd known, you would have changed the way you read it, changed the rhythm, changed the tone, and we would have learned it wrong. She paused. You had to read it like a story for us to carry it like a plan. Nick felt tears burn his eyes. Not grief exactly. Something more complicated. The realization that his wife had loved him enough to use his innocence as a delivery mechanism, that she'd trusted his steadiness so completely she'd built an entire contingency around it. That every night for 5 years he'd been handing his daughters pieces of their mother's final gift, and the gift was the power to protect themselves in a world that would otherwise eat them alive. The door to the conference room opened. Victoria Parker stood in the doorway. She'd come alone, no security, no aides. Whatever she'd learned in the past hour had taught her that the usual armor wasn't going to work here. She looked at the triplets, at the open binder, at Nick, who stood up slowly, positioning himself between his daughters and the woman whose empire their mother had wired to respond to children's voices. "Mr. Martin," Victoria said. Her voice had lost its polish. What's underneath was harder, rawer, more real. Your daughters have spent the last hour systematically activating a series of institutional safeguards I didn't know existed. My senior staff is following orders filed before my appointment. My communications have been rerouted through analog systems I can't override, and a board member just called an emergency session based on a document hand-delivered by an 8-year-old girl. She paused. I need you to explain what the hell is happening. Nick looked at her. This woman who'd dismissed him that morning, who'd laughed with her executives, who'd treated his gray badge like a character assessment. My wife built this company's foundations, Nick said quietly. Not the money, not the brand, the bones, the systems that keep it standing. And she built safeguards into those systems because she knew that eventually someone would prioritize profit over purpose, power over people. She knew it because she'd seen it before. She built a contingency. And she gave the activation keys to our daughters. That's insane, Victoria said, but her voice wavered. A contingency activated by children? No one would design that. My wife would. Nick's voice was steady now. Because children can't be bribed, they can't be bought, they can't be threatened into silence because they don't understand threats the way adults do. They just know what they've been taught. And they've been taught since they were 5 years old to recognize when something is wrong and to know exactly what to do about it. Victoria looked at the triplets. Cora looked back at her with cool assessment. Wren was still writing in her coloring book. Lark had finished her granola bar and was folding the wrapper into a small, precise square. They're 8, Victoria said. They're their mother's daughters, Nick replied. Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question Nick had been dreading. What does the plan do? What's the end game? Nick looked at Cora. Cora looked at her sisters. One of those silent conversations that seemed to happen on a frequency adults couldn't access. Then Cora spoke. The plan doesn't do anything destructive. It reveals. It routes information to the people who are supposed to have it. Board members, auditors, regulatory contacts. Information that's been buried or reclassified or lost in system migrations. Our mother designed it so the truth would surface without anyone having to break the law. Victoria's jaw tightened. That information is confidential. That information belongs to the stakeholders, Cora corrected. Our mother believed transparency was the foundation of institutional trust. She paused. She also believed that anyone who feared transparency probably had something to hide. The silence in the room was absolute. Victoria Parker, CEO of a company worth billions, stood in a conference room being corrected on corporate ethics by an 8-year-old girl carrying a binder her dead mother had hidden in a filing cabinet 7 years ago. And the worst part, the part Victoria clearly couldn't process, was that the child was right. Nick watched the calculation happen behind Victoria's eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of damage, the realization that this plan, this analog human-powered child-activated contingency, had already exposed enough to make suppression worse than cooperation. "Call off your daughters," Victoria said finally. "Let's talk about this like adults." Nick looked at the triplets, 3 blonde heads, 3 faces that carried their mother's sharpness and their father's warmth. 3 children who had, in the span of an afternoon, executed a plan designed by a woman who'd known she wouldn't live to execute it herself. "Do we stop now?" Lark asked. Not Victoria, not Nick, her sisters. The question hung in the air. Cora tilted her head, thinking, processing. 8 years old and carrying the weight of a decision that would determine the future of an institution and possibly the safety of her family. "We pause," Cora said finally. "Like the story. We stop at page 11, but we don't close the book." Nick felt something crack open in his chest. Pride, terror, love so fierce it physically hurt. He turned to Victoria. "My daughters will pause the activation. The information already released stays released. That's non-negotiable. The safeguards remain in place. And you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what my wife built and why she built it." "And if I don't agree?" Victoria asked. "Then we read page 12, Lark said simply. Nobody spoke. The gala continued downstairs. Music, champagne, laughter, the sound of powerful people celebrating their own generosity while 3 floors above them, the architecture of their power had been quietly, methodically, irrevocably rearranged by 3 children and a bedtime story. The aftermath was handled the way these things always are, quietly. A statement was released attributing the disruptions to a legacy system malfunction triggered during routine maintenance. A technical drill, someone called it. A miscommunication. Victoria Parker remained CEO, but the board session Thomas Chen had called produced reforms that would have taken a decade through normal channels. Transparency protocols, stakeholder access provisions, an independent oversight committee that reported not to Victoria but to the institutional structure itself. The structure Nick's wife had built, the structure her daughters had reactivated. Nick was offered a settlement, enough money to pay for the girl's education, to buy a house, to never worry about a gray badge again. He took it. Not because he wanted Victoria's money, but because his wife had designed the plan to end this way. She'd written it into the binder. Section 12, the page Nick had never read. If resolution is achieved without escalation, accept institutional accommodation, protect the children, return to routine. The plan sleeps until it's needed again. That night, Nick sat on the edge of Cora's bed. The black binder was locked in a safe in his closet. The book, the bedtime story, sat in his lap. 3 faces looked up at him. Blonde curls, 8 years old, his entire world. "You were brave today," Nick said. His voice was thick. "Braver than anyone should have to be at your age." "Mom said bravery isn't about age," Wren said. "It's about knowing what matters and doing something about it." Nick smiled through the tears he couldn't stop. "Your mom was the smartest person I ever knew." "She was scary smart," Lark agreed. "In a good way." Nick opened the book. Page 1. The familiar words, the familiar rhythm. But tonight, when he reached the phrase, the one that had echoed through the halls of Whitfield Industries that afternoon, he changed it. Just slightly. 1 word different. "When the cardinal sits on the eastern wire, the house remembers what the builder knew. Not forgot. Knew. The girls noticed. Of course they noticed. They noticed everything." Cora's eyes narrowed. Wren tilted her head. Lark smiled. "That's different, Daddy," Cora said. I know, Nick said. I'm updating the story. Can you do that? Wren asked. Your mother did, Nick said. Every version of this book was a little different from the one before. She was always updating, always improving, always making sure the story fit the world as it was, not the world as it had been. He paused, looking at each of his daughters in turn, and now it's our turn. The girls were quiet for a moment, that particular silence that meant they were processing, connecting, absorbing. Then Lark spoke. So the story doesn't end, it just changes. Nick closed the book. Page 11, like always. But for the first time, the closing didn't feel like an ending. It felt like exactly what his daughter had called it 3 years ago. A pause. The plan wasn't canceled, Nick thought as he turned off the lamp. It was updated. In the darkness, 3 small voices whispered the new phrase back to him in perfect unison. And Nick Martin, single father, maintenance worker, unwitting architect of the most elegant accountability system ever designed, sat in his daughter's bedroom and let the tears fall freely. Not grief, not anymore. Something warmer. Something that felt like his wife's hand on his shoulder. Something that said you did it right. You read it with love. And love was always the activation key. If this story gripped your heart the way it gripped ours, please don't let it end here. Let it remind you that the people the world overlooks are often the ones holding everything together, that children see truths adults have learned to ignore, and that the most powerful plans are built not on technology but on trust. Subscribe if you believe that the ones who are dismissed are often the ones who matter most. And if this moment moved you, share it. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truth, and the world needs to hear it.